necessarily building a new model, but taking a look at it to see what elements need to be recosted. Today, we're seeking guidance on two fronts. One, what is the legislative vehicle that you foresee this effort in 2025 moving forward with? Historically, you've utilized a select committee on school finance or a select committee on recalibration. Both of those terms have been utilized. The membership has been comprised of House and Senate leadership, as well as minority leadership, and then the chairman of the Joint Education Committee and the chairman of the Joint Appropriations Committee. Through that vehicle, whether it be the feed bill amendment or new bill draft, or an amendment to the budget bill, all of those vehicles have been utilized in the past. You would identify the membership as well as a budget for that committee. I would note they meet more routinely than a typical interim committee, up to 7 meetings, 2 days, all over the state. And historically, you have provided that Joint Education Committee members that are not seated on that committee are able to attend those meetings and receive compensation. The second item before you is what consultant or what procurement process would you like to utilize? Your current consultant is Dr. Larry Pikus and Associates. He has been under contract with the state in various capacities since 2001, but in his official capacity as Larry Pikus and Associates since 2005. Mr. Wilmarth has the information regarding what finances are available for this effort. Depending on which route you go from a procurement standpoint will impact the amount that will be necessary to undertake this effort.
Mr. Wilmarth?
Mr. Chairman, I guess I don't have anything else to add with information that Mrs. Heitrek provided you all. If there's any questions I can address, I'm happy to.
Does the committee have any questions regarding procurement or the type of vehicle we want to have for recalibration?
Mr. Chairman?
Yep, Senator Rothfuss, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So the suggestion that, or I guess the option, I should say, that was laid out with regard to having a select committee specifically and then structuring it as described was an effective process in the past, and I think that's an appropriate way to do it. It does take a lot of time. There are a lot of meetings. I think it's important to have leadership representation. It's important to have Joint Appropriations Committee representation. So you have the opportunity to structure the committee where you have the individuals that really need to be on that for proper decision making. And that would be my recommendation, would be to either have that legislation so that we run it as legislation in the upcoming session, or alternatively, we are empowered to create that select committee through the Management Council. Either of those seems like a reasonable approach to me.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Please.
Quick follow-up on that. I think legislation's in order, looking where we're at. I would be much more comfortable with looking at a piece of legislation than I would at a directive. So.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and just one thought I have is I think we ought to write a bill. That way, I think as it gets explained, it'll become clearer to new members what we're doing, and it's easier to digest as well. Mr. Wilmarth.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Office and Mr. President, with the purpose of a bill, the legislature has historically directed data collection requirements through that as well, where by just creating a select committee through the Management Council, you may not have the teeth in order to compel data submission from the executive branch or school districts. And so historically, that legislative vehicle, whether it's through the budget bill or a standalone piece of legislation, has compelled that data submission. And I think that provides a little bit more direction to the executive branch and school districts on what data needs are necessary.
Agreed. Any other questions of staff on either of these issues? No? Senator Rothfuss.
If there aren't any further, well, I guess public testimony, never mind. I was going to make a motion to
No,
have
we're
that
gonna
drafted.
do public testimony next.
My apologies.
All right. We'll now go to public comment on school finance recalibration. Public comment. No public comment here. Any public comment online?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Last chance on public comment here. All right, I'm going to close public comment and I'll go back to the committee. Committee, I'm going to break this up into two things. First, the first thing we'll do is the vehicle to do recalibration, a bill, however we want to do that. So let's address that one first, and then we'll talk about the mechanism of the consultants. So is there any motion on the vehicle? Senator Rothfuss, I think you got a motion.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'll move that we have legislation drafted based on our previous select committee legislation as a template for consideration by the Management Council to sponsor in the upcoming legislative session.
That will include authority for data.
That will include authority for data. That's already in the previous draft, and that was basically what I was meaning by mirroring the previous draft, which had that same type of information. So starting with the same structure as I believe that was the 2020, we did select committee, if I'm not mistaken, so that legislation.
Is there a
Mr.
second?
Chair, Concluding authority to what?
To collect data, to make sure we can get the
Oh,
data
okay.
that we need from the districts and/or the state.
Second.
Second, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on that? All right, all those in favor, we don't need to do any roll call or anything, so it's just a draft bill. So all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries. I would assume that once this bill draft is presented, it will must be to a management council meeting right at the beginning of session when they will decide to forward that bill on to the legislature. Is that correct? Otherwise, we have to have another meeting to do it.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's correct.
Okay. So that's the direction we'll take. This bill will go to management council at the beginning of next session, and they will pass it on. All right, so the next issue is,
Just on that last point, my apologies. Were you contemplating that bill draft be presented at the beginning of the next session to the next management council as it is embodied? Okay.
Yeah.
So not prior to the upcoming session, but at the beginning of the next legislature?
at the beginning of obviously, this meeting of theirs will have to take place prior to
Exactly.
the end of bill sponsorship, because they need to get the bill in, but
Targeting that, okay.
yeah. And so that's a note to you all that will be there. And then, so the next issue is consultants and how we go about procurement. We've talked about there's a variety of issues. Are you guys kind of go over what our options are, and then we'll decide what we want to do? Thank you.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, one option is to sole source with your current provider, Larry Pikus and Associates, along with Dr. Taylor and Dr. Stoddard, who provide information on the monitoring report. Another option is to release a request for proposals through the A&I portal to seek additional vendors that provide this service. And a third option is an RFI, which is a request for information, where you release it and you sort of ask for information that generally is used to draft an RFP, but could also be utilized to glean who is sort of in this arena providing these types of services. So from a procurement standpoint, those are your three options.
And if we do draft an RFP, ultimately we have total control over what we choose out of that RFP process. We're not bound by any particular, it'll do the same thing as the RFI, only we'll probably get a dollar figure to understand what the cost is. Was that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's accurate. You'll understand the underpinnings of this new model. You would understand the cost associated with it. It might provide you more information for consideration about the proposal and the vendors that are coming to the table. rather than an RFI.
All right, sounds good. Is there a motion? Representative Nyman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that we would proceed with an RFP and to reach out to these folks and give them the opportunity to bring back and see who's interested in this and see where we go.
Is there a second? Been moved and seconded.
Mr.
Senator
Chairman,
Nethercott.
there's been two different terminologies discussed in this motion or in this discussion. One is an RFI and one is an RFP. And although those may seem similar, they're actually very different. And so the chairman represented an RFI. The motion was for an RFP. And so we're going to decide today to move forward with the RFP process for then the legislature to select a vendor likely in April. And so we also then further need to discuss, I think, if we're going to direct an RFP, what qualifications or what's going to go into that RFP. Are we prepared to do that today, or are we just going to say do an RFP for qualifications to be determined in months, in January or now? So just some further discussion on that motion.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Kinski.
I appreciate the thought that maybe we should tell staff how to design the RFP, but just speaking for myself personally, it's a lot of times easier to have a draft in front of us, draft that worked the last time, and kind of react to that than just out of the blue try to come up with what the criteria are.
Mr.
That's just
Chairman.
my thought.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Senator Nethercott.
hearing from this, it was my understanding from staff that they would want to go over that with us. And so I just want to put that out there of who should be determining those qualifications and when will that take place if we're going to go ahead and make that motion today to do the RFP process. So knowing that they will want that direction as to what the qualifications for the consultants should be.
Right, and we had a 2017 RFP that was fairly detailed. I think there's some of that they can look at. So do you need, I don't know that we need, let me ask staff, if we pass a motion to create an RFP, you will give us something. If you need further direction from management council on something specific to that, we then can, in our role now, can act if it's, and then after the transition in January, then there can be a different group that handles the RFP. But we could certainly help you if you need help in making the fine-tuned details of that RFP. Is that correct?
Mr. Speaker, I think that's a question for you all to decide how you'd like to move forward in that regard. And one question I did have is, as far as timing with regard to the release and the selection of a vendor, how you foresee that moving forward. What is your direction to staff on that? Procurement does require, just as a side note, that the RFP be on the street for not less than 30 days. And it does take a pretty substantial amount of time to read and score those and conduct interviews if you'd like to do that. So that's sort of some background information we need additional direction on.
So Representative Nyman, I am assuming that you want this RFP out and the information back for the next management council to work on. If we need to provide information, this management council needs to provide any information on if you have a conflict in your mind on what needs to go out in the RFP process, then I think you get a hold of this management council. But then the results of that RFP would then be available for the next management council to make decisions on. Is that accurate? Does that work for everybody or not? Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm on it against the motion. I think this is creating an awful lot of work where all it does is open up possibilities that are less favorable than the original option, which is to effectively use the consultants that we've primarily used in the past with the current model. We're at a time when continuity is important. Contemplating the existing model is important. And we're also too late in the game, frankly. If we wanted to have this conversation, this is the conversation that the management council should have had 6 months ago. Right now, if we go through a full RFP process It will take a long enough period of time that there is no way the select committee would actually be able to fully engage with a recalibration in the depth and understanding that they should. So we would effectively be asking staff to spend the hours to draft an RFP. The best case scenario after that would be the next management council throws it away after all that work. But the alternative course of action would be that they actually release the RFP. So then we begin the process of vetting alternatives where we should not be selecting an alternative to what we have right now, again, just based on sensitivities of the timeline and of the amount of work that goes into recalibration. I've served on a variety of recalibrations, and again, the 2017 recalibration had a full RFP. The timeline was much longer to provide the robust consideration that that RFP needed, and it still had insufficient time after we made the selection for the consultant to, in my opinion, do a complete job and for the committee to provide complete consideration. And then we ended up rejecting it, which was probably appropriate, and returning to the existing model. So while I understand we always like information, we always like to read materials, we like our stacks for these meetings to be as tall as possible, I don't see the value to delaying this process, and I do see the value to getting it started as quickly as possible so the process itself is effective. As I mentioned further, it would be detrimental to the process to make an alternative selection, so at best we would be wasting work. For those reasons, I oppose the motion.
So I have a question for staff. So if we were to kind of assign you this job, and I know it'd be an estimate, to go out with an RFP, and then obviously it has to be on the street a month, right? So what is that a doable time frame to have this available by when? That's the question. Early the next session, the end of next session, how would we, what would we be seeing?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would say you need approximately 60 days to release the RFP. Once it's on the street, it needs to be out for 30 days. And then you need at minimum 30 days to consider that information, execute a contract, reach the terms of the agreement. I would say at minimum 60 days.
60 days before we'd be at a decision point on what to do with the RFP we have in hand.
Mr. Chairman, 60 days before you would be able to make a decision on a vendor. So, well, really 30 days, but, signed, sealed, and delivered, you're ready to start work 60 days from the date that you release it to the day that the contract is signed. Maybe we could do it in 45 days if they were particularly favorable in their contract terms. And the proposals were easy to read and you didn't have any questions, but.
How long to develop an RFP? So you had 60 days after, so you got to add that into the total.
Mr. Chairman, if it's your direction to focus our attention on that, we'll turn to it immediately following this meeting. So I would say less than a week.
Senator Rothfuss. No, I'm too late. I called you.
Fair. In 2017, when we selected an alternative, one of the things that took a while, honestly, was that alternative vendor, once they were selected, getting up to speed where they actually understood what was going on, which to me, my recollection was that had to be 2 or 3 months. I don't remember what it was. Do you have a recollection of how long it was until they could actually comment credibly on what was going on in the state of Wyoming? And candidly, at the end, I didn't feel like they knew as much about the model as our staff did.
So Matt, how long did it take you to train a new consultant?
Mr. Chairman, I believe a vendor was selected sometime in June or July, and I don't think the first meeting with that consultant was for another month or month and a half. I can't recall the exact timeline, but it does take time if you have a different consultant than you have today to just understand Wyoming's system. And complicating it more is I anticipate the current or new alternative consultants would also have to respond to the court directives out of the current litigation. And so that's another complicating factor, understanding the history of the courts. And so it'll take time. I don't know. It just depends on who would potentially be selected.
Representative Yin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I think my decision on this motion is really a cost-benefit analysis and a determination of whether it's the best and most efficient use of government time. So, Ms. Heitreck, since we've done this process before with an RFP, do you know how much that cost the last time around?
Please.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative, no, but we could get that information to you and send it to the committee.
All right, we have a motion on the floor, which is to develop an RFP that would be available, would go out and be available for the next management council to act on the results of that RFP. So any other comments? Okay, I'm just going to do a voice vote, voice vote. So all those in favor of going out with an RFP for school finance recalibration signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No. So I'm going to do a hand. So all those in favor, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. All those opposed? Motion fails, 3 to 6. So I need another motion on what the direction to staff is.
Mr. Chairman.
Please, Senator Rothfuss.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I move that staff work with our existing consultant to begin the process for recalibration by doing a bench recalibration study.
Desk audit?
Desk audit, that's what we called it, yeah, desk audit. And begin to develop the materials through that consultant to fully educate the select committee and get them up to speed on the existing model.
Is there a second? It's been moved and seconded. You know, I'm just going to make my one comment. The reason I voted the last time aye is that's the same amount of work, only more, probably actually expending money on a consultant where the next management council might dump all of that idea and go do something else. So I think there is that, so I probably vote against this motion.
Mr. Chairman.
Please.
A quick response to that. First of all, we already have that consultant under contract, but yes, we'd be paying for hours for that. That's understood. But second of all of that background information and the desk audit would feed into any work we did from that point forward effectively, regardless of whether we end up later going out for an RFP and having someone else come in that is, in my view, literally exactly what you would hand that next consultant. And then if we selected the same through an RFP later by the next management council, you would obviously have that work already done, which is necessary. It's also essential to getting the select committee up to speed, all information they would need, whether we stick with the existing or change. So I don't see it as possibly being redundant work. I mean, maybe a small portion of it could end up being unnecessary, but the vast bulk of it under all scenarios would be. And again, it seems like the far and away most logical path to proceed on, based on, as mentioned, existing litigation and everything else we have to consider, would be to maintain the consultant anyway.
So just a reminder to the group, desk audit, and I'll give you my version of what I think it is. So the current consultant would go in and the desk audit would tell you what components he feels should be recalibrated. Is that correct? That's my recollection.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Speaker Summers Correct. Generally, the contractor historically has reviewed the current literature to the model resources and reviews those areas that perhaps are not up to current educational standards and compares those against the current educational literature. Additionally, I think, depending on the timing of a court decision, could also provide some guidance on those areas that the court deems unconstitutional. And having that information evaluated while the session's going on, if the decision's provided before then, certainly provides an accelerated approach on how to respond to those.
Mr. Chairman, I'd make sure that the motion reflected that possibility also. I didn't explicitly state that, but I think that is an important feature.
And the desk audit won't say that you need to spend this amount more, this amount less. All the desk audit does is say which elements probably need recalibration. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman, it's to revalidate the cost basis of the components within the model and how districts deployed model resources to align with educational strategies that were foundational in that model.
I realize you read that, but you didn't tell me anything.
So he would look at the cost of each component. It's possible if you directed him to come with a cost-based recommendation, say on safety and security or school lunch or mental health, all areas that have come up in the recent litigation, he would give you a recommendation for a cost-based component on that element.
So we're making a motion now to do a desk audit. We need to understand what desk audit we're doing and what the outcomes are, correct?
Mr. Chairman, the desk audit would be within your purview to decide how that looks and what components you would like him to look at and whether you would like cost-based recommendations. In 2010, that was what the desk audit was comprised of. He looked at the cost-based elements, he didn't bring new issues to the table, and then he looked at how do school districts deploy these to improve education across Wyoming, and is there any disconnect between those two? It wasn't sort of this in-depth professional judgment panel with extensive interviews and input by the school districts.
Senator Rothfuss.
And this doesn't have to be the last motion. This is a get-started motion going down a specific pathway. You'll recall that the beginning of the last few recalibration processes with Picus and Odden included an ask of what do you want us to work on? And then we worked together as the select committee and said, all right, we want an analysis of this and this and this. So all of those things are still on the table and are not precluded anyway. This is let's get the ball rolling down a certain path that is going to be a valuable path, and then the next legislature, as we work through the select committee legislation, will certainly have the opportunity to have input, but we won't be wasting this time. The work will begin in a direction that is going to be necessary regardless of how that legislature proceeds.
Representative Stiff.
Mr. Chairman, for Ms. Hytrack, at a question, you mentioned a potential that the desk audit might include looking at whether there's a disconnect between the model and how resources are deployed. Would an example of that potentially be the fact that the model now provides for an assistant principal for schools that are really, no matter how small they are? So you can have a school with just 10 pupils, but the way the model works, they get not just a teacher and a secretary, but they also get an assistant principal. And it's my understanding that if you've got a school with 10 students, the school districts, in fact, do not hire an assistant principal to go out to that, 10 pupil schoolhouse. Is that an example of what a desk audit could do, or is that not a good example?
Mr. Speaker, Representative, yes, that's exactly things that they might look at, how their model has a disconnect when the resources are deployed. We also know, they employ far fewer teachers, but at greater salaries. That might be something that they would look at. The Kruger report prepared by the Department of Education would be critical to that effort.
Any other comments on this? I don't disagree with the motion, and I'm not going to be here. I think it's the right path to go down. I just don't think, I think we're doing it prematurely. So I'm probably no vote on this. as well. All right, all those in favor of the motion to do a desk audit, to go out to the current contractor and do a desk audit for recalibration signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed?
No,
No. Motion carries. All right, I think that covers recalibration, right? We got us a bill, we got us a direction, and so now we are going to go to lunch. All right, it's 12:12. Mr. Chairman, what do you want to come back?
We'll stand adjourned until 1:30.